The wire cutters bit through the fence with a sharp snap that echoed across the moonlit pasture. Cabe Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool October night, his weathered hands steady as he worked through another strand. Behind him, Dutch Kellerman held the horses while young Tommy Reeves kept watch, both men grinning at how easy this had become. Easy money, Cabe thought as he snipped the final wire. The old fool sleeping in that ramshackle house probably wouldn't even notice until morning. Hell, he might not notice at all. 6 months of this game, and the decrepit rancher hadn't lifted a finger to stop them. Ezra Whitman, if that was even his real name, seemed content to let his cattle disappear into the night like morning mist. The 3 rustlers had started small, testing the waters with a few head here and there. When no resistance came, no sheriff, no hired guns, they grew bolder. Tonight would be their biggest haul yet. Tommy Reeves spat into the dirt and adjusted his gun belt. At 19, he was the youngest of the trio, all swagger and impatience. Tommy claimed he'd killed a man in Abilene, though the details changed with each telling. He wore his hat tilted back, revealing a shock of dirty blonde hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to enjoy the work too much. The cattle stood docile in the darkness, maybe 60 head of prime beef, worth good money in the next county where no questions got asked. Cabe had contacts there, men who paid cash and kept their mouths shut. Dutch walked his horse closer, leather creaking softly. He was the careful one of the group, methodical and thorough. Where Tommy was all fire and bravado, Dutch planned 3 moves ahead. His real name was Heinrich Kellerman, but he'd been Dutch since the war. A thick beard covered most of his face, but his eyes stayed sharp and calculating. "We've taken near 200 head from this spread over the months," Dutch observed quietly. "Old man's got to be hurting by now." "Good," Tommy replied with a harsh laugh. "Maybe he'll finally give up and move on. Leave the whole place for us to strip clean." Cabe studied the distant ranch house where a single lamp glowed in one window. The structure looked tired, like everything else about this operation. Paint peeled from the siding, the porch sagged slightly, and weeds grew tall around the foundation. A far cry from the grand spreads they'd heard about in the old days. The light in the window suggested the old man might be awake, but Cabe doubted it mattered. What could one ancient rancher do against 3 armed men? Ezra Whitman had to be pushing 70, maybe older. He lived alone, worked his small herd with no help, and never seemed to leave the property except for monthly supply runs to town. A perfect target, in other words. The rustlers had done their research. No family, no hands, no friends that anyone could see. The nearest neighbor lived 40 miles south, and the local sheriff was just a kid named Billy Crawford who spent more time drinking than enforcing the law. Even if the old man complained, which he never had, what could Crawford do? 3 men's word against one. Tommy mounted his horse and rode into the herd, starting to separate the cattle with practiced ease. The animals moved reluctantly, but without much fuss. They'd been through this routine before, though they wouldn't remember these particular thieves. Cabe watched the house for any sign of movement. The lamp continued to burn steady, but no silhouette appeared in the windows. No door opened, no voice called out a challenge. Just the peaceful sounds of night and the soft lowing of cattle being nudged toward the gap in the fence. Inside that modest house, surrounded by worn furniture and faded photographs, Ezra Whitman slept the sleep of the defeated. Or so it appeared to the men stealing his livelihood one head at a time. The rustlers had grown so confident they barely bothered with stealth anymore. Dutch began driving the cattle through the gap while Cabe gathered up the cut wire, planning to leave the fence open as a final insult. Let the old fool puzzle over what happened to his herd. By morning, these cattle would be 20 miles away, headed for market and conversion into cold cash. The plan was simple and had worked perfectly for months. Drive the stolen cattle to a hidden canyon Dutch had discovered, hold them there for a few days, then move them to buyers who asked no questions. Clean, efficient, profitable. Tommy rode back toward the fence line, whistling softly under his breath. He'd spotted a young bull among the herd that would bring top dollar. The kid had an eye for quality beef, Cabe had to admit, made up for his tendency toward unnecessary violence. As the last of the cattle passed through the gap, Cabe took one final look at the silent house. No movement, no sound, no sign that anyone inside cared about the theft happening under his nose. The old rancher had given up, Simple as that. Probably grateful someone was taking the burden of those cattle off his hands. The three men mounted their horses and began the familiar drive toward their holding canyon. Behind them, the cut fence stood open like a wound in the night, and 60 head of prime cattle disappeared into the darkness as if they'd never existed at all. Dawn broke gray and cold across the Texas rangeland, painting the horizon in muted shades of amber and steel. Ezra Whitman emerged from his house carrying a steaming cup of coffee, his movements deliberate despite his 73 years. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but something else caught his attention immediately. The fence line stood violated again, wire strands curled back like metallic flowers where the cutters had done their work. Ezra sipped his coffee and surveyed the damage with what appeared to be weary resignation. Another gap, another theft, another night when decent men slept while predators prowled. He walked slowly toward the break in the fence, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The tracks told the familiar story. 3 horses, maybe 60 head of cattle driven northeast toward the Badlands. Professional work, he noted quietly. These weren't desperate men grabbing what they could. This was systematic. Back in the house, Ezra opened a leather-bound ledger that sat on his kitchen table beside a stack of yellowed newspapers and unopened mail. The book contained meticulous entries written in careful script, each page documenting a theft with the precision of a bank teller recording transactions. August 15th, 42 head missing. Northeast pasture fence cut. 3 riders. September 3rd, 37 head taken. Same fence line. September 28th, 51 head. October 6th, 44 head. And now this morning's theft would join the growing record. The ledger revealed a pattern spanning 8 months, each entry more detailed than any sheriff's report. Estimated weights, approximate ages, breed descriptions, even weather conditions on the nights of the thefts. Someone reading these pages might assume they belonged to a man obsessed with his losses, cataloging every detail of his helplessness. They would be wrong. Ezra's pale blue eyes, sharp as winter ice despite his age, studied each entry with the focus of a man calculating odds. His weathered hands, marked with old scars and liver spots, turned the pages with practiced care. The morning light streaming through his kitchen window illuminated more than just the ledger. Legal documents lay scattered across a nearby desk, official papers bearing territorial seals and courthouse stamps. Land deeds, water rights certificates, business correspondence dating back decades. A careful observer might notice the names on these documents didn't all match the simple rancher who lived here alone. Edwin J. Whitman, E.J. Whitman Holdings, Whitman Cattle Enterprises. The papers told stories of vast holdings, complex business arrangements, and influence that stretched across 3 territories. But those days seemed long past, filed away like memories of a different man. 20 miles northeast, in a hidden canyon carved by ancient waters, Cabe Morrison counted cattle with the satisfaction of a man whose plans never failed. The stolen herd milled about in the natural corral formed by sheer rock walls, ready for the drive to market in 2 days' time. Dutch sat on a boulder sharpening his knife, the steel singing against the whetstone in steady rhythm. He'd found this canyon 2 years ago while running from a posse, and it had served them well ever since. Water from an underground spring, grass for grazing, and only one way in or out that could be easily watched. "We're getting too comfortable," Dutch observed without looking up from his blade. "Old man's bound to notice eventually." Tommy laughed harshly while he counted the cattle for the 3rd time. "Notice what? That he's lost near 200 head? Hell, he probably thinks they wandered off or died of some disease. Old fool's half-blind anyway." Cabe studied the herd with the eye of an experienced cattleman. Prime beef, well-fed and healthy. The old rancher might be finished, but he'd raised good stock. These animals would bring top dollar from their contacts in Sweetwater, no questions asked. The buyers in Sweetwater had proven reliable over the months. They paid in gold coin, kept no records, and asked only that the cattle arrive healthy. What happened before that was none of their concern, a policy that suited everyone involved. Tommy kicked at a stone, his restless energy needing an outlet. "Been thinking," he announced, his voice carrying the dangerous edge it always held when he'd been drinking. "Maybe we should just finish this business properly." "Meaning what?" Cabe asked, though he suspected the answer. Old man's seen our faces, knows our horses. What happens when he finally gets tired of losing cattle and rides to town? What happens when that sheriff starts asking questions? Dutch's knife stopped moving against the stone. The silence stretched long enough for a hawk to circle overhead, crying out across the canyon walls. Murder brings attention, Dutch said finally. Cattle theft is one thing. Killing a man, even a used-up old rancher, that brings federal marshals and real investigation. Tommy's eyes gleamed with something ugly. Who says anyone would find the body? Accidents happen all the time. Old man falls off his horse, breaks his neck. House catches fire with him inside. Could be anything. Cabe found himself considering the suggestion despite his better judgment. The kid had a point about loose ends, even if his methods lacked subtlety. They'd been fortunate so far, but fortune had a way of changing when you relied on it too heavily. The canyon fell silent except for the sound of cattle and a distant trickle of spring water. Each man considered the implications of crossing from theft to murder, weighing profit against risk in the ancient calculus of criminal enterprise. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Ezra Whitman hitched his aging mare to a weathered wagon and prepared for his monthly trip to town. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what he seemed, an old man making a supply run, moving slowly and carefully as age demanded. The 40-mile ride to Brazos Bend gave him time to think. The town sat squat and dusty under the October sun, a collection of false-fronted buildings that served the scattered ranches and farms of the territory. Most folks minded their own business here, which suited Ezra perfectly. He made his usual stops first. General store for coffee, flour, and ammunition. Hardware store for fence wire and nails. The barber shop for a trim that made him look even more harmless and grandfatherly. Anyone watching would see nothing more suspicious than an old rancher conducting ordinary business. But his final stop told a different story. The telegraph office sat at the end of Main Street, a small building that connected this remote corner of Texas to the wider world beyond. Ezra entered quietly, nodded to the operator, and composed a brief message with the economy of words that comes from long practice. Package ready for delivery. Usual terms apply. Respond soonest. The message was signed with a simple initial, W. The telegraph operator, a nervous young man named Peters, accepted the message and payment without comment. He'd sent similar cryptic communications for the old rancher before, though he never asked about their meaning. In a territory where asking too many questions could prove unhealthy, Peters had learned discretion early. As Ezra prepared for the long ride home, he reflected on patterns and patience, on the difference between appearing helpless and actually being so. The rustlers thought they'd found easy prey in an isolated old man. They had no idea they were stealing from someone who'd spent 50 years learning that the best revenge was served with careful preparation and legal justification. But before you find out what happens next, if you're enjoying this story of hidden strength, hit that like button and comment what country you're listening from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. Now stay with me, because what's coming will change everything these rustlers think they know about their easy target. 3 days later, the rustlers returned with the brazen confidence of men who'd never faced real opposition. This time they rode openly across the range in broad daylight, their horses kicking up dust clouds visible for miles. The morning sun caught the metal of their gun belts and rifle stocks, announcing their presence like a war party approaching a defenseless settlement. Ezra watched them come from his front porch, rocking slowly in a chair that had weathered 20 Texas winters. He sipped coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, his pale eyes tracking the riders with the detached interest of a man observing distant weather. The Winchester leaning against the porch rail appeared forgotten, just another piece of ranch equipment gathering dust. Cabe Morrison led the trio directly to the house this time, abandoning all pretense of stealth. His face wore the hard expression of a man who'd made difficult decisions and intended to see them through. Dutch flanked him to the right while Tommy took the left, their positioning casual but tactical. The horses stopped 20 feet from the porch, close enough for conversation, far enough to avoid any sudden moves from the old man. Leather creaked as the riders shifted in their saddles, hands resting near weapons with practiced ease. "Morning, old-timer," Cabe called out, his voice carrying false friendliness over genuine menace. "Nice day for a conversation about business arrangements." Ezra continued rocking, his weathered face showing no emotion beyond mild curiosity. Coffee steamed in the cool morning air as he studied his uninvited guests with the patience of a man who'd learned to listen before speaking. Been thinking about your situation here, Cabe continued, gesturing broadly at the modest ranch spread. Isolated place like this, no neighbors, no help for miles. Man could get into serious trouble without the right kind of protection. Dutch watched the exchange with growing unease, his experienced eyes noting details his companions missed. The old man's stillness seemed too complete, too controlled. Something about his posture suggested coiled energy rather than frailty. Tommy grew impatient with the careful approach, his young face flushing with aggressive heat. Hell with this dancing around, he declared loudly. Old man, you got papers for this place? Deed and such? Ezra's pale eyes shifted to the youngest rustler without his head moving. Inside the house, he replied quietly, his voice carrying the gravel of age and weather. Why would that concern you, son? Because we're thinking this spread might be better managed by younger hands. Tommy shot back, his temper rising with each word. Thinking maybe you should sign those papers over to folks who can work the land proper. The suggestion hung in the morning air like smoke from a grass fire, dangerous and spreading. Dutch shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, recognizing the escalation for what it meant. They'd crossed from simple theft into something far more serious. Ezra stopped rocking. The motion ceased so abruptly that even his coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. For a moment, the only sounds came from horses stamping and leather creaking as the animals sensed tension their riders couldn't yet perceive. Boys, Ezra said finally, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he might use to discuss whether you're making a mistake you can't take back. Tommy's hand dropped to his gun, but with the instinctive aggression of a young predator sensing defiance. The movement was smooth and practiced, the result of countless hours drawing on bottles and fence posts. What kind of mistake would that be, old man? The kind that gets men killed, Ezra replied without changing expression or tone. His pale eyes never left Tommy's face, studying the young rustler with the detached interest of a naturalist observing a dangerous but predictable animal. Tommy's temper snapped like a dry branch under pressure. He swung down from his saddle with violent energy, his boots hitting the ground hard enough to raise dust. His hand remained near his weapon as he stalked toward the porch with the swagger of a man who'd never been truly challenged. Maybe you need some convincing about how serious we are, Tommy declared, climbing the porch steps two at a time. His right hand shot out to grab the old man's shirt front, hauling him up from the rocking chair with surprising strength. The coffee mug fell, shattering against the porch boards in a spray of brown liquid and white ceramic. Ezra allowed himself to be pulled upright, his body appearing frail and unresisting in the younger man's grip. Tommy's left hand drew back for a blow designed to break an old man's nose and crush his remaining resistance. The punch came forward with all the power of youth and confidence, aimed to destroy what little fight the rancher might possess. The blow connected solidly, snapping Ezra's head back and sending blood trickling from his nose. Tommy released his grip, letting the old man stagger backward against the porch rail with what appeared to be devastating effect. Now maybe you'll listen to reason, Tommy announced, his voice carrying triumph and satisfaction. We want those papers signed over legal and proper, or things get worse for you. Ezra touched his bleeding nose with one weathered finger, examining the red stain with clinical interest rather than pain or fear. His pale eyes remained steady on Tommy's flushed face, as if memorizing every detail for future reference. Dutch had been watching the scene with growing unease, his experienced instincts picking up signals his younger companions missed. Something about the old man's reaction bothered him, a calmness that seemed unnatural for someone facing violence and dispossession. His gaze wandered past the confrontation to the open doorway behind Ezra, where the interior of the modest ranch house was visible in the morning light. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Law books lined one shelf of the main room, expensive leather-bound volumes that seemed wildly out of place in this humble dwelling. Their gold lettering caught the light, revealing titles about territorial statutes, property rights, and criminal prosecution. But it was the initials tooled into one spine that stopped Dutch's breathing entirely. EJW Edwin J. Whitman. Dutch's face drained of color as memory flooded back like water through a broken dam. Stories he'd heard in saloons and around campfires. Legends passed down from older hands who'd worked the great spreads in their youth. Tales of the cattle baron who'd once controlled 2 million acres across 3 territories, who'd employed his own army of gunmen and maintained his own court system on lands larger than some eastern states. Edwin J. Whitman, the man who'd owned half of Texas before the war changed everything. "Boys," Dutch said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the short distance to the porch. His throat felt dry as sand, and his hands had begun to tremble slightly on his reins. Cabe glanced back at him with irritation. "What is it, Dutch? Can't you see we're conducting business here?" "This is Edwin Whitman," Dutch replied, the words falling like stones into still water. "The cattle baron. The one who owned half of Texas before the war." Tommy laughed harshly, blood from Ezra's nose still staining his knuckles. "That was 40 years ago, you fool. Look at him now. Just another broken-down old man who can't protect what's his." But Dutch had been around long enough to recognize the difference between appearance and reality. The old man's stillness wasn't frailty. His calmness wasn't resignation. It was the controlled patience of a predator choosing his moment. Ezra straightened slowly, his posture shifting in subtle ways that transformed his entire presence. The stoop in his shoulders disappeared. His head lifted to reveal the full intensity of those winter-pale eyes. His hands, which had appeared gnarled and shaking, now seemed steady and purposeful. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, like watching a man remove a carefully constructed disguise. The frail rancher faded away, replaced by something far more dangerous. "You boys have until sundown," Ezra said, his voice carrying new authority that seemed to fill the morning air around them. "You'll return every head of cattle you've taken from my land. Every single animal. After sundown, this becomes a matter for the law." Tommy's confidence wavered as he found himself staring into eyes that held no fear, no uncertainty, only cold calculation. The old man he'd just struck seemed to be growing larger somehow, his presence expanding to fill the entire porch. "The law?" Tommy managed, his voice cracking slightly. "What law? There's no law out here, old man." Ezra smiled then, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. It was the smile of a man who knew secrets these boys couldn't imagine, who held cards they'd never even suspected existed. "Son," he said quietly, "I am the law." The ride back to their canyon hideout passed in tense silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about what they'd witnessed at the ranch. The horses picked their way through the rocky terrain, while their riders processed the implications of Dutch's revelation and the old man's transformation. Tommy broke the silence first, his voice carrying forced bravado that fooled no one. "So what if he used to be somebody important? That was 40 years ago. Man's still just one old fool against 3 of us." Dutch shook his head, his weathered face grim with understanding his companions lacked. "You don't know what you're talking about, boy." Edwin Whitman wasn't just rich. He was connected, had judges in his pocket, marshals on his payroll, politicians who owed him favors. That kind of influence doesn't just disappear. Cabe had remained silent during the confrontation, but now his mind raced through calculations and possibilities. The cattle theft had been profitable, but manageable risk. What Tommy had escalated them into was something far more dangerous. At the canyon, they dismounted and gathered around their small fire, the stolen cattle lowing softly in the natural corral formed by rock walls. The familiar sounds of their operation felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that their victim wasn't the helpless target they'd assumed. "We got 3 choices," Cabe announced, his voice carrying the authority of leadership. "We can return his cattle and ride out of the territory. We can just ride out and forget the cattle. Or we can finish this permanent-like." Dutch immediately shook his head at the third option. Murder brings federal attention. Killing a man like Edwin Whitman, even if he's retired, that'll have marshals swarming this territory like hornets. Tommy spat into the fire, causing it to hiss and smoke. "You're both yellow," he declared with the absolute certainty of youth. "Old man's bluffing. What's he going to do? Wire Washington? Tell them some cattle thieves hurt his feelings?" But Dutch had lived long enough to recognize real danger when it presented itself. The old man's eyes had held something that went beyond simple anger or threat. They'd held the cold certainty of a man who'd killed before and would do so again without hesitation. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, telegraph messages began arriving with remarkable speed for such a remote location. The first rider appeared at sunset, spurring a lathered horse toward the modest house where Edwin Whitman waited on his porch. The messenger handed over an envelope bearing official seals, accepted payment without comment, and departed immediately. Ezra read the contents by lamplight, his pale eyes showing satisfaction at the response he'd received. The telegram came from Austin, signed by Territorial Marshal Wade Garrett. Message received. En route with deputies. Estimate arrival tomorrow sunset. Maintain defensive position until support arrives. Garrett had been a young deputy when Ezra controlled his vast holdings, one of many lawmen who'd learned their trade enforcing order on the great cattle spreads. Unlike many who'd grown corrupt with power, Garrett had remained honest and competent, rising through the ranks on merit rather than influence. A second message arrived an hour later, this one from the local sheriff's office in Brazos Bend. Young Billy Crawford had written in his careful schoolboy script, "Uncle Edwin, got your wire. Daddy always said you might need help someday. 3 deputies riding out first light. We'll be there." The family connection wasn't widely known, but Crawford's father had been Ezra's business partner decades earlier, before the war changed everything. The boy had grown up hearing stories about his godfather's legendary status, though he'd never fully believed them until now. Ezra smiled as he read the second message, remembering a gangly 12-year-old who'd spent summers at the ranch learning to ride and shoot. Billy Crawford had become a capable lawman in his own right, honest and competent despite his youth. Inside the house, Ezra began methodical preparations that spoke of long experience with violent confrontation. From a hidden compartment behind the kitchen stove, he withdrew his father's Army Colt, a weapon that had seen service in 2 wars and countless personal disputes. The revolver showed its age but remained perfectly maintained, its metal bright with oil and its action smooth as silk. Ezra loaded 6 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition, each cartridge inspected for defects before sliding into the cylinder. The Winchester came next, a lever-action rifle that could put holes through men or animals at distances that would surprise the Rustlers. He'd purchased the weapon new 15 years earlier, after his military surplus Spencer finally wore beyond repair. As he cleaned and loaded his weapons, Ezra's mind drifted back to his service during the Apache conflicts of the late 1850s. Captain Edwin Whitman, 3rd Cavalry, tasked with protecting settlers and maintaining order along the frontier. He'd learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation, skills that had served him well in building his cattle empire. The Apache had been worthy enemies, intelligent and determined fighters who'd taught him valuable lessons about patience, planning, and decisive action. Unlike these rustlers, who relied on intimidation and superior numbers, the Apache had understood that victory often went to whoever could wait longest before striking. Back at the canyon, the debate continued as darkness fell and the fire burned lower. Tommy had grown more insistent about violence, his young pride unable to accept retreat in the face of an old man's threats. "Only way to handle this is permanent," Tommy declared for the 3rd time. "Make it look like an accident. Old fool falls off his horse, breaks his neck. Happens all the time to men his age." Cape found himself wavering between caution and greed. They'd invested months in this operation, building relationships with buyers and establishing profitable routines. Walking away meant starting over somewhere else with nothing to show for their efforts. "What if Dutch is wrong?" Cape suggested finally. "What if the old man's just bluffing with that name? A lot of folks claim to be someone famous when they're backed into a corner." Dutch studied the fire with the expression of a man who'd seen too much to dismiss obvious dangers. "The law books weren't fake," he replied quietly. "Those initials were real. And that look in his eyes, that wasn't the look of a man who's bluffing." But Tommy's bloodlust had infected Cabe's thinking, appealing to his greed and pride in equal measure. They'd come too far to be scared off by an old man's reputation, no matter how fearsome it might once have been. "We finish this tomorrow night," Cabe decided, his voice carrying finality. "Make it look like robbery gone wrong. Nobody's going to investigate too hard over one dead rancher, no matter who he used to be." Dutch realized then that his partners had crossed a line he couldn't follow. Murder was different from theft, carrying consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But he also knew that arguing further would only mark him as a potential problem to be solved. The three men settled into uneasy sleep as the fire died to embers, each lost in his own thoughts about the violence to come. Above them, stars wheeled across the vast Texas sky, indifferent to the plans being made in the hidden canyon below. At the ranch, Ezra maintained his vigil through the night, weapons close at hand and senses alert for any sound that might indicate approaching danger. He'd sent messages to allies and prepared his defenses, but experience had taught him that survival often depended on personal readiness rather than outside help. Dawn brought no sign of the Rustlers, but Ezra knew they would come. Men like Tommy Reeves didn't back down from challenges to their pride, and men like Cabe Morrison couldn't abandon profitable operations without exhausting every option first. The day passed slowly, marked by routine chores and careful observation of the surrounding terrain. Ezra checked his fence lines, tended his remaining cattle, and maintained the appearance of normal ranch operations while staying alert for signs of approaching enemies. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, three riders emerged from the Badlands like harbingers of violence. They rode slowly but purposefully, their intentions clear from their formation and the weapons visible in their hands. Ezra watched them approach from his porch, the Winchester across his knees and the army Colt on his hip. The rocking chair creaked softly as he maintained the rhythm that had become his signature, a deceptively peaceful sound that masked the deadly tension of the moment. The Rustlers stopped at the same distance as before, but this time their hands rested openly on their weapons. The pretense of negotiation had ended, replaced by the honest brutality that had always lurked beneath their civilized facade. Time was up. The sun hung low and blood-red above the western hills as the three Rustlers approached the ranch house for the final time. Their horses moved with the careful gait of animals sensing their riders' tension, ears swiveling at every sound across the silent rangeland. Ezra rose slowly from his rocking chair, the Winchester held loosely in weathered hands that showed none of the tremor age might have brought. His pale eyes tracked each rider with the calculating precision of a man measuring distances and angles, cataloging threats with decades of experience. "Well, old man," Cabe called out as they drew rein 20 yards from the porch, "you had your chance to be reasonable. Time's up for talk." Ezra stepped down from the porch with fluid motion that belied his 73 years, his boots hitting the packed earth with solid authority. The transformation that had begun yesterday was now complete. Gone was any pretense of frailty or helplessness, replaced by the controlled presence of a man who'd killed before and would do so again. "Boys," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the distance with perfect clarity, "last chance. Ride out or face the consequences." Tommy's young face twisted with rage and wounded pride. "The hell with your chances, old fool. You should have signed those papers when you had the option." The youngest Rustler's hand dropped to his gun with the practiced speed he'd honed through countless hours of practice. His fingers wrapped around the worn grip of his Colt, confidence flooding through him as he prepared to demonstrate the folly of defying younger, faster men. The draw seemed smooth and certain to Tommy's mind, his weapon clearing leather with satisfying speed. But as the barrel came level, time seemed to slow and distort around him. Ezra's hand moved with mechanical precision rather than raw speed, 60 years of muscle memory overriding the limitations of age. The Army Colt appeared in his grip as if materialized by magic, its heavy barrel tracking toward Tommy's center mass with inevitable certainty. The report of the old revolver echoed across the rangeland like thunder, rolling back from distant hills in diminishing waves. Tommy's weapon discharged into the ground as his nerveless fingers released their grip, his young body folding around the massive bullet that had torn through his chest. He hit the earth with the finality of youth learning its first and last lesson about real gunfighting, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky he'd never see darken into night. Dutch and Cabe sat frozen for a heartbeat, their minds struggling to process what they'd witnessed. The old man's draw hadn't appeared particularly fast, but somehow his gun had spoken first, delivering death with surgical precision. Dutch broke first, spurring his horse toward the barn while clawing for his rifle. His experienced instincts recognized the tactical situation immediately, dismounted fighting against a prepared opponent who held the advantage of position and cover. But Ezra had anticipated this move, his pale eyes reading Dutch's intention before the rustler had completed his turn. The Winchester came up smoothly, its lever working with the fluid rhythm of long practice. The rifle's crack followed immediately, sending a .4440 slug across the intervening distance with mathematical precision. Dutch's body jerked in the saddle as the bullet found its mark, his rifle tumbling unfired to the ground as he toppled from his panicked horse. Cabe found himself alone, facing an opponent who'd just killed 2 men with the casual efficiency of a professional. His own weapon remained holstered, his hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. "Now hold on there," he called out, his voice cracking with sudden fear. "No need for more shooting. We can work this out reasonable-like." Ezra worked the Winchester's lever, chambering a fresh round while keeping the weapon trained on the surviving rustler. His pale eyes showed no emotion beyond cold calculation, the look of a man solving a tactical problem rather than taking human life. "Time for reasonable talk ended when your friend there drew iron," Ezra replied matter-of-factly. "Question now is whether you're smart enough to see how this plays out." Cabe's mind raced through rapidly diminishing options. Fighting meant certain death against an opponent who'd just demonstrated superior skill. Running meant turning his back on a marksman who could clearly hit what he aimed at. "I got information you might want," he offered desperately. "About our operation. Other spreads we've hit. Names of our buyers." Before Ezra could respond, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of reinforcements. 4 riders emerged from the Eastern Trail, their horses lathered from hard travel and their badges glinting in the dying sunlight. Marshal Wade Garrett led the group, his weathered face grim with purpose as he surveyed the scene. Behind him rode 3 deputies, all young men who'd heard stories about Edwin Whitman but never expected to see the legend in action. Garrett dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many years in the saddle, his hand resting on his gun, but as he approached the tableau of violence, his eyes took in the 2 bodies, the smoking weapons, and Cabe's raised hands with professional assessment. "Afternoon, Edwin," Garrett said quietly, his voice carrying the respect of a subordinate addressing a former commander. "Looks like you started the party without us." Ezra lowered the Winchester slightly but kept it ready, his attention split between Cabe and the arriving lawmen. "Wade," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Appreciate you making the ride." These boys decided negotiation wasn't in their best interests. The marshals studied the scene with experienced eyes, noting the positions of the bodies and the defensive advantages of Ezra's chosen ground. The tactical situation told its own story about who'd held the initiative throughout the brief battle. Young Sheriff Crawford sent word ahead, Garrett explained as he examined Tommy's body. "Says these boys have been working this territory for months, hitting spreads from here to the Brazos." Cabe seized on this opening, his voice carrying desperate eagerness. "That's right, Marshal. We got a whole network set up. I can give you names, places, everything you need to roll up the entire operation." Garrett turned his attention to the surviving rustler, his pale eyes holding the same winter coldness that marked his former commander. "Information's valuable," he agreed slowly. "Question is whether you're worth keeping alive to provide it." The marshal's words carried implicit threat that made Cabe's blood run cold. These weren't ordinary lawmen operating within comfortable legal boundaries. These were frontier justice dispensers who measured guilt and punishment by harsher standards than civilized courts. Ezra stepped closer to Cabe's horse, the army Colt still held ready in case the rustler decided on a final desperate play. His pale eyes studied the man who'd orchestrated months of systematic theft from his property. 43 men, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent evening air. "That's how many I killed during my years wearing a badge and building my holdings. All of them needed killing, every single one." Cabe's face went white as the implication of those words sank home. The old man wasn't just making conversation. He was providing context for what came next. "Question is," Ezra continued in the same conversational tone, "whether number 44 is sitting on that horse right now, or whether he's smart enough to make himself useful to Marshal Garrett's investigation." The rustler's hands shook as he maintained his surrender posture, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. Around him, 5 armed men waited for his answer with the patient attention of predators, allowing prey one final chance at survival. "I'll tell you everything," Cabe whispered, his voice barely carrying across the short distance. "Names, places, buyers, the whole operation. Just don't kill me." Garrett nodded to his deputies, who moved to secure the prisoner while maintaining careful awareness of their surroundings. The marshal had learned long ago that successful operations could turn deadly in seconds if anyone relaxed their vigilance. As Cabe was pulled from his horse and bound with practiced efficiency, Ezra walked to where Dutch's body lay crumpled near the barn. The rustler's eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky, his weathered face peaceful in death. "Heinrich Kellerman," Ezra observed quietly, reading something in the dead man's features that spoke of shared history. "Fought in the war, if I'm reading those scars right. Shame he chose the wrong side of this particular conflict." Garrett joined him beside the body, his expression thoughtful as he studied the man who'd come so close to escaping justice. "Good eye for detail, Edwin. Most folks wouldn't have caught the military bearing." "Old habits," Ezra replied simply. "Man learns to read other men when his life depends on accuracy." As darkness settled over the Texas rangeland, the marshal's party made camp near the ranch house, while Cabe provided detailed information about the rustling network that had plagued the territory for months. His testimony would lead to arrests across 3 counties and the recovery of hundreds of stolen cattle. But for Edwin Whitman, justice had already been served in the ancient way of the frontier, swift and final, and written in gunpowder smoke under the endless western sky. Dawn broke clear and cold across the Texas rangeland, illuminating a scene that would be remembered in this territory for generations to come. 2 bodies lay covered with blankets near the ranch house, while Marshal Garrett's deputies worked methodically to document the aftermath of frontier justice served swift and final. Cabe Morrison sat bound against a wagon wheel, his face drawn with the pallor of a man who'd looked death in the eye and found his life hanging by the thread of his own usefulness. Throughout the long night, he provided detailed testimony about the rustling operation that had plagued ranchers across 3 counties. The canyon hideout yielded treasures beyond what anyone had imagined. When Garrett's expanded posse rode into the hidden stronghold, they discovered not just Ezra's stolen cattle, but evidence of systematic theft spanning 2 years and multiple territories. 847 head of cattle bore the brands of 17 different ranchers, some from spreads over 100 miles away. The rustlers had been far more ambitious and organized than anyone suspected, running what amounted to a criminal enterprise that threatened the economic foundation of the entire region. Marshal Garrett stood amid the recovered herd, his weathered face showing grim satisfaction as he tallied the scope of the operation. In his 30 years of law enforcement, he'd rarely seen theft conducted on such a massive scale with such methodical precision. "Edwin," he called to his former commander, who sat his horse surveying the canyon with the detached interest of a general reviewing a battlefield. "This operation was bigger than cattle rustling. This was organized crime." Ezra nodded slowly, his pale eyes taking in details that spoke of careful planning and substantial investment. The canyon had been modified for long-term use, with corrals built from stone and timber, water sources improved, and supply caches hidden in the rock formations. "Someone financed this," Ezra observed quietly. "Boys like Tommy and Dutch don't think this big on their own. There's money behind this operation, Eastern money most likely." Garrett's investigation over the following weeks would prove that assessment correct. The rustling network extended far beyond 3 cowboys stealing cattle for quick profit. Banking records revealed connections to Chicago meat packers who asked no questions about the origin of beef shipped east at below-market prices. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Ezra found himself in the territorial courthouse in Austin, providing testimony before a federal grand jury investigating organized crime on the frontier. His quiet authority and detailed knowledge impressed prosecutors who'd been struggling to understand the scope of the criminal network. The hearing room fell silent as Edwin Whitman described the systematic nature of the thefts, his meticulous record-keeping providing evidence that law enforcement had failed to gather through months of investigation. His ledger became the foundation for indictments that would ultimately break the rustling syndicate. Federal prosecutor James Mitchell studied the elderly rancher with professional respect as Ezra concluded his testimony. The man's precision and attention to detail reminded Mitchell of the best military officers he'd encountered during his own service in the war. "Mr. Whitman," Mitchell said as the formal session ended, "your documentation and testimony have been invaluable. Have you considered returning to law enforcement in an official capacity?" Ezra's pale eyes held something that might have been amusement as he considered the suggestion. "My days of wearing a badge are behind me, prosecutor. But I'm always willing to assist when honest men need help bringing criminals to justice." The federal investigation expanded rapidly as Cabe's testimony and Ezra's evidence provided prosecutors with a roadmap to the entire criminal network. Arrests followed across 3 territories, dismantling an operation that had stolen thousands of cattle and corrupted local officials from Texas to Kansas. 1 month after the courthouse testimony, young ranchers began appearing at Ezra's modest spread, seeking advice about protecting their herds from organized theft. Word had spread through the territory about how the legendary cattle baron had defended his property against professional criminals. Robert Chun, a Chinese immigrant who'd established a small ranch 40 miles south, arrived with questions about fence design and early warning systems. His broken English couldn't disguise his intelligence or determination to succeed in a land that offered opportunity alongside constant danger. Ezra spent an afternoon showing Chun how to read sign, identify potential threats, and establish communication networks with neighboring ranchers. The lessons extended far beyond simple security measures, encompassing the broader principles of community defense and mutual assistance. Margaret O'Sullivan rode up 3 days later, a red-haired Irish woman whose husband had been killed in a rustling raid the previous year. She'd maintained their small spread alone, but recent threats suggested organized criminals were testing her resolve. "Ma'am," Ezra said as he helped her dismount near his front porch, "I knew your husband Patrick. Good man, fair dealer, didn't deserve what happened to him." Margaret's green eyes flashed with determination that reminded Ezra of his late wife's spirit. "I'm not running, Mr. Whitman. This land is all I have left of Patrick, and I'll defend it proper." Over the following weeks, Ezra found himself becoming an unofficial mentor to the next generation of ranchers, teaching hard-won lessons about survival and success on the frontier. His students included former soldiers seeking new lives, immigrants pursuing American dreams, and widows determined to maintain their independence. The lessons extended beyond practical matters of ranch security and cattle management. Ezra shared the deeper wisdom he'd gained through 5 decades of building and protecting wealth in a lawless land, emphasizing the importance of legal preparation and community networks over individual heroism. 3 months after the confrontation, the territorial legislature passed comprehensive livestock protection laws based partly on recommendations from Edwin Whitman's detailed analysis of organized rustling operations. The new statutes provided legal frameworks for cooperative defense agreements between ranchers and streamlined prosecution of cattle theft. Governor Samuel Bradford personally requested Ezra's input on the legislation, recognizing that the elderly rancher's experience spanned both the lawless early days of territorial expansion and the more civilized approaches needed for sustained economic development. The laws became known informally as the Whitman Statutes, though Ezra had requested his name not be associated with the legislation. His preference for quiet influence over public recognition reflected lessons learned during his years of wielding power across vast holdings. 6 months later, attempted rustling raids in the territory had dropped by 70%, as word spread among criminal elements that organized resistance awaited anyone targeting the region's ranchers. The network of communication and cooperation that Ezra had helped establish proved more effective than increased law enforcement alone. Local newspaper editor Franklin Pierce wrote a series of articles about the transformation, though he never identified the catalyst by name. Pierce understood that some stories were best told without revealing all their secrets, particularly when ongoing effectiveness depended on maintaining certain mysteries. 1 year after the confrontation, Marshall Garrett visited the ranch to report on the final resolution of the federal investigation. 37 indictments had resulted in 29 convictions, effectively destroying the organized rustling network that had plagued multiple territories. The convicted criminals received sentences ranging from 5 years in territorial prison to 20 years in federal penitentiary, depending on their roles in the criminal enterprise. More importantly, the financial networks that had supported the operation were exposed and dismantled, making similar large-scale operations far more difficult to establish. Edwin, Garrett said as they sat on the familiar porch where violence had erupted 1 year earlier, you've done more to bring law and order to this territory than any dozen marshals could have accomplished. Ezra rocked slowly in his chair, watching the sunset paint the western hills in shades of gold and crimson. The Winchester no longer leaned against the porch rail, returned to its place inside the house now that immediate threats had passed. Law and order aren't things you bring to a place, Wade, he replied thoughtfully. They're things you build with patience and proper foundation. Takes time, but the results last longer than quick solutions. 2 years after the confrontation, Sheriff Billy Crawford brought news that would have surprised anyone who remembered the nervous young lawman who'd once doubted his own abilities. Crawford had been elected to represent the territory in the state legislature, his reputation for honest law enforcement providing him with broad political support. Uncle Edwin, Crawford said, using the family title he'd employed since childhood, they want me to chair the Committee on Territorial Law Enforcement. I could use your advice on where to start. The conversation that followed lasted through the evening and into the night, touching on topics ranging from practical police procedures to the broader principles of justice administration. Crawford took careful notes, recognizing that he was receiving a graduate education in law enforcement from one of its most successful practitioners. The young sheriff's rise to political prominence would eventually lead to his appointment as Territorial Attorney General, a position he used to implement systematic reforms in law enforcement procedures. His policies reflected lessons learned from Edwin Whitman about the importance of preparation, cooperation, and legal precision. 3 years later, Ezra made his weekly pilgrimage to the small cemetery where his wife Eleanor rested beneath a simple granite stone. The modest grave marker bore only her name and dates, but the surrounding area had been transformed into a garden that bloomed year-round with careful tending. Eleanor, he said quietly, kneeling beside the grave with the slow movements of age and arthritis, the work's nearly finished. Territory's safe again, law means something, and the young ones are learning to take care of themselves. The cemetery stood on a hill overlooking his original ranch headquarters, the grand house and extensive outbuildings that had housed his empire during its peak. Those structures remained empty now, maintained but unused, monuments to a different era in his life. 5 years after the confrontation, delegations of young lawmen began arriving at the ranch for what became known as informal training sessions. These men came seeking education in frontier law enforcement from someone who'd seen every variation of criminal enterprise and jurisdictional challenge. The sessions typically lasted a week, with Ezra sharing lessons learned through decades of maintaining order across vast territories. His students included deputy marshals, county sheriffs, and federal agents, all drawn by his reputation for practical wisdom and proven results. Marcus Thompson, a young federal marshal from Colorado, summarized the experience in his official report. Training with Edwin Whitman provides education unavailable through any formal law enforcement academy. His emphasis on preparation, legal precision, and community cooperation offers invaluable lessons for frontier law enforcement. The informal training program expanded gradually, as word spread through law enforcement networks about the quality of education available at the modest ranch in Central Texas. Ezra never charged for the instruction, considering it his contribution to building the stable, lawful society that Eleanor had dreamed of seeing. 10 years later, the ranch had become an unofficial academy for frontier law enforcement, hosting training sessions that attracted students from across the Western Territories. The program remained small and selective, accepting only candidates recommended by serving officers who'd proven their commitment to honest law enforcement. Ezra, now 83 but still sharp in mind and steady in judgment, continued personally conducting the advanced sessions that covered the intersection of law enforcement and territorial politics. His students included men who would eventually become territorial governors, federal judges, and influential legislators. The impact of these training sessions extended far beyond individual careers, as graduates carried Whitman's principles into law enforcement agencies across the expanding nation. Their influence helped establish standards and procedures that would shape American law enforcement for generations to come. 20 years after the confrontation with the Rustlers, Edwin Whitman passed quietly in his sleep at the age of 93, surrounded by the peace and order he'd spent his life creating. His funeral drew attendees from across the nation, including federal officials, territorial governors, and dozens of lawmen whose careers had been shaped by his guidance. The ranch property was donated to the territorial government with specific instructions that it continue serving as a training facility for law enforcement officers. The Edwin J. Whitman Academy for Frontier Law Enforcement opened 6 months later, institutionalizing the educational programs that had operated informally for decades. Today, visitors to the academy can still see the porch where an elderly rancher faced down 3 armed rustlers with nothing but courage, preparation, and a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. The site serves as a reminder that true strength often wears the mask of humility, and that justice served with patience and precision creates foundations that endure far longer than quick solutions. If you enjoyed this tale of justice, patience, and the power of proper preparation, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hidden strength and frontier courage. We bring you tales of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through wisdom, determination, and unwavering commitment to what's right. Until next time, remember that true power often lies not in what we show the world, but in what we keep quietly ready when courage demands action.